Earlier this week, I began discussing H.R. 1. This is the House Democrats' marquee bill for the new Congress. I've stated this week that it really adds up to one big, expensive, partisan power grab, an effort to centralize more control over America's speech and America's voting here in Washington. The Democratic Politician Protection Act. I'm pleased that people are beginning to pay attention to this monstrosity. A monstrosity. Today, I want to focus on how the power grab would affect our elections. Because when Washington politicians suddenly decide their top priority is grabbing unprecedented control over how they get elected and sent to Washington in the first place, alarm bells should start ringing all over this place. After all, Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution clearly gives state legislatures primary responsibility for, quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. Now, there are times in American history when it has come to that. There have been times when our nation has needed the federal government to get involved to expand and protect the franchise or to respond to a national emergency. For example, bills like the Voting Rights Act, which secured the franchise for African Americans, or the Help America Vote Act, which provided guideposts to prevent a crisis like the Bush versus Gore recount from occurring a second time. So what is the alleged crisis now? What is the alleged crisis now? In 2019, that has House Democrats calling for an unprecedented federal takeover of elections across our country. Why is this Democratic bill, which would create more federal government mandates over the minutia of the election process than has ever been done in the past, necessary now? 2016 saw the most ballots ever cast in a presidential election in American history. Now, with population growth, that isn't entirely surprising, but the turnout rate was the third highest since 1968. So people are voting in great numbers. Let's look at the 2018 midterms, the highest midterm turnout in 50 years. So people voted in the midterms. And listen to what Americans themselves had to say about their experience. After the election, 92%, Madam President, 92% of surveyed voters told the Pew Research Center their voting experience was very easy or somewhat easy. 92%, very easy or somewhat easy to vote. Regardless of when they voted and how they voted, huge majorities communicated they had no real trouble casting their ballots. No trouble. So my Democratic friends seem to be implying there's a supposed crisis here that conveniently is not rooted in the facts or in the opinions of American voters. There's no objective basis for the sweeping federal takeover of elections that House Democrats have dreamed up. No emergency. It's just a Washington power grab for its very own sake. Decision after decision that our Constitution properly leaves the states just melts away in this proposal. Practically every variable of any consequence to American elections gets a top-down mandate written by whom? Why, the Democrats, of course. Could states require a signature to vote under the Democrats' bill? Only if they accept a computerized mark, making that signature requirement about as serious as clicking one checkbox on a website. What if states and localities want to make sure that ineligible voters under the age of 18 don't end up on the voter rolls? Or decide whether or how convicted felons have their voting rights restored? Well, under the Democrat Politician Protection Act, states have no choice in the matter. How many early days of voting should there be? The polls need to be open on Sundays. What's the best way to make absentee ballots available? When can early voting take place, and how long? And where should the polling places be located? Different states and communities have come to different legitimate judgments on all these questions. It's a core part of our constitutional system. And the decentralization of our election process leads to a more democratic system with more direct impact on the elections of those decision makers. The United States of America has never been about centralizing all power in Washington, and Washington should not get to micromanage the processes that determine who comes to Washington. But alas, House Democrats don't seem to care if their partisan power grab upsets this constitutional balance. These representatives, even get this, want the federal government to dictate to states how their very own congressional districts will be drawn. They want the federal government to tell the states how to draw the congressional districts. Right now, there's a competition of ideas among the states about the best way to handle this. Different places arrive at different answers. Naturally, House Democrats have a different idea. They want to force every state to use a commission that is designed by them, by Washington Democrats. Every state will have to use a commission designed by Washington Democrats, whose structure and procedures are prescribed, of course, by Washington Democrats. And if a state doesn't know how to bow to their will, then the D.C. federal court will make the decisions that have been reserved for the state legislatures going back to our nation's founding. So, Madam President, I know it's not fashionable on the far left to praise the wisdom of our constitutional structure. It seems to be out of fashion. I'm sure that in some corners, I'll be derided for referencing the Constitution at all. How could it still be relevant after all these years, they will say. But of course, this thinking shows exactly why our founding principles are so important. Our Constitution is there to protect our liberties and protect our form of government from the whims of whoever happens to currently be in power. These guardrails exist to stop things like a narrow partisan majority in the House of Representatives grabbing control of election laws just to benefit themselves politically. We need to stand with Alexander Hamilton and our Constitution, not with the House Democrats' partisan power grab.